The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this REMI webinar, Economic Impact Analysis versus Cost-Benefit Analysis and Comparison. I'm Brian Reel, Marketing and Event Coordinator at REMI, and I'll be hosting this webinar. David Casazza has been an associate at REMI for 2.5 years, and he'll be presenting this webinar. At REMI, we provide economic modeling software that policymakers use to make better informed policy decisions. If you have any questions about REMI, I encourage you to reach out to info@remi.com, and we'll assist you in any way we can. If you have any questions during this webinar, I encourage you to use the question box at any time, and following the conclusion of the presentation, I'll moderate these questions to David. About an hour after the webinar concludes, a copy of the recording and the slides from this webinar will be sent to you in an email. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and take it away, David.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Brian. Welcome, everybody. My name is David Casazza, as Brian mentioned previously. Apologies real quick. And yeah, the topic of today is comparing and contrasting economic impact analysis and cost-benefit analysis. As we'll learn, it's not necessarily weighing one against the other. A lot of the time, it's actually going to be even in combination with one another. So I think that'll be a kind of a good takeaway as well as we move forward. Without further ado, here's a broad overview of what we'll be going over. First, I'll be going over general, kind of the broad strokes of each, and also just analysis in general, some perspective on that. Then I'll go into each of them specifically, first EIA and then CBA. After that, I'll be comparing and contrasting, as well as, like I mentioned, noting the combination of the two when it comes to different approaches to analysis, depending on your own perspective as an individual within your role within an organization, your organization's role within the larger economy or state or apparatus. And then I'll be going into a specific example using some data to inform a cost-benefit analysis, an economic impact analysis, and then using those in combination. Finally, we'll be finishing with a question and answer session. You can feel free to pose the questions in the chat box, and we will receive them in real time. However, I'll most likely be answering those at the end of the session. But feel free to ask questions as we go along so that you don't forget or anything. So just a broad overview of analysis in our day and age. With the availability of data, and that includes macroeconomic data like that REMI uses, drawing from federal sources like the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the census, as well as microeconomic data for smaller, not necessarily smaller projects, but more at the local level, the state level, the project level. It's more feasible for different organizations, both large and small, to actually run their own forms of analysis on their own or in conjunction with larger organizations, larger projects. Along with the possibility for this form of analysis, we also have sort of the necessity for this kind of analysis, particularly with larger decisions being made, at the federal level, the level of a country or countries, or even at the state level. We have some states comprising a huge amount of the US GDP. Of course, it becomes almost like making a nation state level decision. But even then, at a smaller scale, securing funding, for example, is a good reason to actually run your own analysis to show that whatever prospective project that you're pursuing has been vetted to be had to have a positive return on investment, to have a beneficial impact on the regional economy that it will be situated in. So it's important both for the interests of the organization that's running the analysis, as well as to sort of assure those who are funding the project, whether they be federal or state government authorities, whether it be a local government, or whether it be a partner organization in the private sector. These forms of analysis are vital to communication as well as just informing our own decisions. So as the name of the webinar kind of stands out, two forms really stand out: economic impact analysis, or EIA, and cost benefit analysis, or CBA. Just a brief note on cost benefit analysis. CBA is a little bit more of an older term. I think that the term, with the inception of this kind of approach, this has been the title, and it's still used today. However, over time, the term benefit cost analysis has kind of come more into the vogue. There's a number of reasons for this. One, it's a bit just in terms of the name of the form of analysis. Benefit cost analysis might sound a little bit better than cost benefit analysis. It emphasizes that you're weighing the benefits against the costs, which I'll go into the exact mechanism by which one can do that. So throughout this webinar, I might call it CBA, I might call it BCA. That's more what I'm used to. But just to clarify and to avoid confusion, both in the webinar as well as when communicating with others afterwards. Just to emphasize, the terms are interchangeable and the forms of analysis are identical. So this is a broad overview of some of the characteristics of both economic impact analysis and cost benefit analysis. You can see that each line tends to have sort of an analogous counterpart on the other side. So if we start with EIA, economic impact analysis focuses on an event that impacts some form of economy. Some either aggregation or disaggregation or segmentation of the economy. So that could include, the entire national economy of the United States. What's the impact on the economy? It could impact a region of the United States. So a state, a county, a collection of states or counties, so Southeast, Northeast, Midwest, West, what have you. It can also be applied to a sector of the economy. So what is going to be the impact on this industry if some project goes through or does not go through? We're thinking about, let's say, a power plant closure. We're going to see impacts, obviously, on the broader economy, but more specifically, we'll see impacts on the energy industry or the energy sector and those who take part in it. The goal is to analyze the impact from a more ostensibly objective angle, but it may be used to make a decision, and we'll see how that kind of compares and contrasts with the CBA. What we mean by this is that we are doing sort of it being economic impact from a sort of social scientific perspective. Now, obviously, economics are tied hand in hand with business interests, with the interests of state, local, national governments. But this idea of it being an objective impact and not necessarily something where people are making a decision does help define the scope of an economic impact analysis. One of the more comprehensive studies that, for example, that Remy did was seeing the economic impact of Hurricane Katrina when that came through in coordination with the Army Corps of Engineers. Now, there wasn't any decision being made. There were later decisions made about, how can we prepare for this kind of disaster in the future? How can we respond to this current natural disaster? But no decision was being made necessarily in that economic impact analysis per se. So in that way, you can see that it's not so much that we're necessarily weighing one thing against another. We're saying, okay, something happened or is happening or it's going to happen, and we're just trying to see what the impact is going to be on, again, general economy, a part of the economy, segmenting it by sector or by region, what have you. But there is oftentimes, usually, some form of comparison. So in the economic impact analysis, we may look at levels, which just means if, for example, after after a factory is built in a specific region, we take a tally of all the jobs in the region and we say, okay, there's 50,000 jobs in this region. That doesn't mean that the factory made 50,000 jobs. It just means that after the factory was built, in total in the region, there are 50,000 jobs. Now, what we also look at are differences, and I'll go more into this when we go into economic impact analysis specifically, but we may compare different forecasts, and in particular, what we'll be comparing is a baseline forecast, basically saying ceteris paribus, nothing else changes, or I should clarify, nothing changes at all. There's no new project, there's no new factory being built. What is the forecast employment going to be? We take that baseline forecast and we compare it to the sort of experimental forecast, or the change in the economy. The difference, let's say without the factory, there are going to be, I don't know, 40,000 jobs in the region. That baseline forecast, we would compare that 40,000 to 50,000, and that gets us a difference of 10,000. Therefore, we can kind of tie 10,000 jobs being created directly to, not directly, I don't want to misuse the term, but 10,000 jobs are tied to the construction in some way, shape, or form to that factory being constructed and operated. And also within economic impact analysis, there are sometimes factors that are not necessarily totally comparable to one another. What do I mean by that? And so obviously we hear about GDP, we hear about productivity and output, if you're more familiar with economic terms. To almost everybody, what people are thinking about and the factor that is often entered in politics and regional planning and regional development, economic development, are jobs. A job does not necessarily have a specific dollar value. It's not necessarily fungible for other economic variables. Nevertheless, it is an integral part of economic impact analysis, just because it has a very specific impact on people within the region and the economy. I'll go into more examples later, but for now we'll move on to CBA. So cost-benefit analysis is basically vetting a possible investment being made by a specific party. That is typically how it's being used, and you'll notice that I've emphasized on the CBA side that the goal is to make a decision. This is in contrast with economic impact analysis, where, like the example that I gave with natural disaster, there's not necessarily a decision being made. And it would behoove the policymaker to, make a decision on how to respond to an event, and therefore maybe there will be a follow-up economic impact analysis. But with a cost-benefit analysis, there is an explicit weighing of costs against benefits, benefits against costs. And as we'll see, it has a clear line of viability. I'll go into what that means in a moment. And it also synthesizes different factors across years into net benefits, net costs, or a ratio. So the reason I put only net benefit is that ostensibly, if it's going to be a project that actually benefits the interested party or parties, you will see a net benefit. The benefits will outweigh the costs to some magnitude, or you'll see a cost ratio of greater than 1, which I'll go into more. But unlike an economic impact analysis, like I mentioned, where we have factors such as employment, another example would be the impact on something like a Gini coefficient, which is measuring the level of inequality. You can't weigh a coefficient necessarily against a dollar value. There may be the means by which to do that. Going down the line, maybe it's the number of dollars that are transferred from one income level to another, from one industry or sector to another, through this economic activity. But economic impact analysis does not necessarily have that. While a cost-benefit analysis, it's going to take all those factors and put them in line with dollar values that are comparable to one another so that we can weigh cost and benefits against one another. So some more specific details on economic impact analysis. Obviously here at REMI, that's kind of our bread and butter. That's what we do. And it has a few different components and also just kind of characteristics and ideas to keep in mind. So first we need some form of model or framework. A basic component or concept within this model or framework is the idea of economic multipliers. Basically, what that says is if there is a change in one economic factor, you're going to see some magnitude of change in other factors. Now, that might be where if there's an increase in one factor, then there's actually a decrease in another. It might be that there is an outsized impact from one to the other. So, for example, if we see an increase in GDP, then we're going to see an increase in output that is greater in magnitude than the impact on GDP. Another example would be, let's say there's $1 million in some way or form. Maybe it's there's a tax refund or a tax benefit that is transferred from the government to consumers of $1 million. We might say that the marginal propensity to consume, basically how much of one's income is put towards consumption as opposed to savings or other, is 0.75, then we would say that if we see $1 million increase in personal income, then we're going to see $750,000 in increased spending in the region. And this kind of goes down the line from there. We would take that $750,000 and then say, okay, well, that's spent somewhere. That means other people's or businesses or what have you, personal income is going to increase by $750,000. Down from there, I think it's around $560,000 will then be respent, circulating throughout the economy. So in line with that, we have the kind of the bedrock and the most widely used form of this kind of analysis is input-output modeling. Broad strokes, what this is if we have one sector that is seeing an increase in business, let's say construction, for example. Construction is good partially because everything impacts construction almost, and construction impacts a great deal as well, and it's more kind of fundamental understanding. If we see an increase in construction activity in a region, let's say there's a project, some kind of factory or some kind of development being built, we're not just going to see an increase in activity in that region, in that industry. We're also going to see an increase in activity for the raw materials that construction uses. We're going to see an increase in, let's say, different consultants that are being used for construction, different planning methods. Maybe if there are consultants traveling from outside, we'll see increases in food and beverages and amenities and accommodations for them to travel to the site. So in large part, it's about the supply chain of the region. And then the REMI model, on top of input-output modeling, does use economic equilibrium, economic geography, and different economic equations. I won't go into this too much, just in the interest of time. But generally for, again, economic impact analysis, we are then quantifying those impacts. So these are in italics, some of the larger kind of categories that both here at REMI and in general for economic impact analysis that are focused on. And like I mentioned before, it's not necessarily going to all be dollar values. So employment and population are two great examples of an economic impact analysis where it's not specifically a dollar value. We put a lot of things into a dollar value, but not everything, just because when you say it creates 50,000 jobs, you don't then say, okay, how many dollars is that? You understand that a certain number of jobs, if 20,000 people move into a county or a region of some kind, you don't say, okay, well, how much, I don't know, how much money is 20,000 people? That wouldn't make much sense. Now you can express that, like we mentioned, there will be increases in personal income, increases in GDP, but you wouldn't necessarily want to express population in dollar values. And then finally, for economic impact analysis, a really crucial point is the idea of direct, indirect, and induced impacts. Direct impacts can be, and this applies to all of, I believe all of these, particularly like output, GDP, employment, personal income. You can divide these into direct, indirect, and induced impacts. So direct activity are those, as the name would imply, directly related to the project. So it might be the actual economic activity of some kind of factory that's being constructed. It'll be, if it's employment, it'll be the workers that are working at the factory as well. Indirect relates to those, the supply chain of the project. So I mentioned like input-output modeling, whatever raw materials, whatever contractors that and sometimes there's some delineation between contractors being direct or indirect employees, but that's neither here nor there. It deals with the supply chain. So you'll see impacts on the raw materials. If it's, I don't know, microchip factory, you'll see demand for silicon and other raw materials that are used in that as well. Machinery is a good example. Machinery is used in all sorts of, retail and industrial applications. And from those two, we get induced impacts. And oftentimes the induced impacts is missed out on simpler forms of economic analysis. Remy model does take into account induced impacts. And what that says is, well, there are direct employees, there are indirect employees. Those employees are then going to take their income, and like I mentioned with marginal propensity to consume, they're going to be spending those dollars on, it could be their own rent, it could be investing or purchasing a house, investing in real estate. It could be just food and entertainment and other goods and services. That additional demand is going to create even more economic activity in the region or regions or area, whatever the area is that we're looking at. So you can see basically there's a much larger ripple effect in place here in an economic impact analysis, depending on the scope. Next, we'll go into cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis at face value is a bit more simply presented, and I'll go into why it at face value and in the presentation it is much simpler. But because of the constituting parts, it might actually have a lot more going on under the hood, or it might have more going on under the hood. I'll go into more into that. So yeah, again, instead of simply being an event, it's some kind of decision being made. Oftentimes it's against a budget or it's against the returns on some form of expenditure. So it has an explicit, what we call a viability point, or it has a measure of viability. So the first step is to identify and quantify different costs and benefits. And this can kind of range very widely. To deviate from the factory example that I gave, a good example of a cost-benefit analysis will be an infrastructure project being conducted by or pursued by a state or local government. So obviously the government has to pay for everything going on, whether it's paying a contractor, and then the contractor provides the raw materials and the employment or what have you. It might be its public employees, and then the state actually directly purchases raw materials, wages, and purchases raw materials, then directly pays wages and salaries. There might be lost revenues due to the activity. So if it's a road that's being constructed, a highway, then you're going to see some reduced efficacy of that road, even if in the long term it'll be beneficial for that transportation corridor. We're going to see some impact in the short term in a negative way, just because of the construction. So those are some of the costs. The benefits will be different forecast revenues, and it will be weighed against those costs in some way. So the second step is discounting and a sensitivity analysis. A discount rate and discount rates can vary between different projects. For our purposes, in the following example that you'll see in a few moments, the discount rate is set at 7%. So essentially what that does is it is weighing the opportunity cost of spending the money now on something as opposed to spending it later, as well as on one project versus another. And this discount rate is set in order to calculate the net present value of each benefit and cost in each year. So if you're familiar with real fixed dollars, set to a specific year, and nominal dollars, this is related to that in some way, although it's not necessarily related to inflation. So, but the same concept, where a dollar in one year is not necessarily worth the same as a dollar in another year. Not necessarily, not because of inflation per se. That's maybe a little bit more with economic impact analysis, but more so that saying that we are spending money now, and then when we get the money in the future, it's not worth a dollar a year from now is not worth the same as a dollar now. That's kind of the calculus that's going on there. And finally, when we get a net present value for benefits against the net present value of costs, we weigh them against one another. Usually what this looks like is a benefit cost ratio. At least in my experience, that's what is usually being used. So we take the benefits and we divide them by the costs. If that ratio is greater than 1, then the project is viable, which means that you are getting more back than what you spent. Kind of saying to re-emphasize what I mentioned about discounting and finding the net present value. Again, if you're spending $1, let's say you spend $1 million this year, and then you're getting $1 million next year, your benefit cost ratio is not going to be 1 because due to time and what have you, that's not necessarily the same thing. It's not going to be worth the same in a year as it is now, just because of the opportunity to spend, not necessarily because of inflation. But there is, besides benefit cost ratio, there is also the ability to just subtract the costs from benefits, in which case the viability point will be 0. If benefits are greater than the costs, then you'll see a greater than 0 value. If they're not, you'll see less than 0 value, and that's probably not a viable project, at least within the parameters that were set. I think that's another good point to mention, is that these viability points are as informative and as useful as the benefit cost analysis that's being undertaken. If you're missing certain factors, you're missing certain costs, or you're missing certain benefits, if the scope of the project is not being fully taken into account, like I mentioned before, if you're only looking at, let's say, with economic impact analysis, if you're only looking at the direct impacts, you're missing out on indirect, you're missing out on induced, and that can multiply the impacts of some projects many times over the direct impacts. So this viability point is only going to be as useful as the scope and the kind of the veracity of your method. So that is economic impact analysis and cost benefit analysis. We'll go into kind of some comparison and, like I mentioned, combination. And afterwards, we'll go right into the model and show an example. So weighing the applications of economic impact analysis and cost benefit analysis, oftentimes you can use both on a project. It more has to do with the perspective that the organization or the individual, the entity is bringing forward. So, like I mentioned, for example, let's say it's a tax policy change that's expected to take place or is being weighed. And of course, you can also do a retrospective, so it's not necessarily forecasting per se. We'll be looking at the impact on the government, on consumers, on citizens, or it could be the impact on a specific industry. Meanwhile, the cost-benefit analysis will be coming from a specific perspective. Now, there is a bunch of overlap there because it could be that the perspective is of the state government, so therefore the perspective would be for the entire state economy. I think a good example of this is actually one of our clients, Empire State Development. they integrate, and it's not unique to ESD necessarily, but just an example that comes to mind. Benefit cost analysis and economic impact analysis are integrated, right? We see the impacts to jobs and GDP and other factors, which is very important. But they're also a economic development corporation. They're, it's important to them that they're showing that they're having not just an impact, but that the tax dollars are being spent wisely and in a way that actually benefits hopefully not just the state, but also the state government and the budget, but also the state economy. So to that end, they have a few different forms of benefit cost ratio that they use. They weigh, for example, GDP against let's say it's the incentives of a tax policy that they're using to incentivize certain economic activity. They'll weigh GDP against it. They'll weigh the state forecast state revenues because of this policy against it. They'll weigh the local revenues against it. And then they even have their own measure called economic benefit, which adds I believe it's disposable personal income plus the local government revenues plus the state government revenues. So what that kind of tries to measure is, okay, we have the citizens, we have the consumers, we have the taxpayers, we have the local governments, we have state governments. If we sum the increases to their incomes, their revenues, how do we weigh that against the expenditures of the state government? And so when you see returns that are greater than 1 that way, maybe it makes it more feasible to say, okay, well, even if the state is has a value that's close to 1, maybe it's a little bit less than 1, a little bit greater than 1 for a benefit cost ratio, maybe so. But if it's not explicitly benefiting the state in a great way, it is benefiting, the state government. It is benefiting the state and its local governments and its taxpayers in a great way. So that's kind of in line with that. What I said, that the usefulness of that benefit cost ratio, or that the difference of the net present values of the benefits and the costs, it's going to be based on how you define them, essentially. So yeah, I guess that's a good example. And these are kind of some other examples. Cost benefit analysis is also, I guess I'll mention this as well. It's used far more often for private entities. So kind of vetting the risk of different financial investments and vetting risk and safety assessments. And to that effect, other factors might be taken into account. If we see on the economic impact analysis side, it might be used all by itself. We're just looking at GDP and what have you. But it might be used in conjunction with, in combination with other forms of analysis that are then quantified to then inform a cost-benefit analysis. So economic impact analysis, let's say again, it's the factory example. You can't just look at the number of jobs that are being produced. What's going to be the impact on the environment, on wastewater, the impact of other wastes, raw materials that are cast off, air pollution if there is any. What is the social impact? What does the local community think of this project? Is it going to impact them in some way positive with employment, or negative with I don't know, changing amenity factors in some way, or yeah. So they can be used in combination with one another. Kind of how I'm visualizing it now, and maybe it's I'm sure there'll be others with a better perspective on this. I'm visualizing cost-benefit analysis as being, it can be very, very limited in its scope, or it can be very broad. Meanwhile, economic impact analysis, it tends to have the same kind of definitions, right? The same contributing factors of GDP and employment and what have you. But the scale of it is dependent on the region, on the sector, what have you. But meanwhile, cost-benefit analysis, I might have a number of different factors that are then distilled into explicit dollar values, that net present value. So there's a great amount of overlap, great amount of coordination and combination. And to that effect, I'll be showing a quick example of how REMI has been used to conduct a economic impact analysis and a cost benefit analysis. Okay. We'll be using Transite for this. Actually, I apologize. I show this. This is just a quick diagram showing that basically Transite allows for integrating travel demand data into and project data into the REMI model. These, just for reference, these slides will be available and this recording will be available in case you want to take a closer look at this diagram or if you have additional questions about the diagram. But of note also is that the Transite model now has a benefit cost analysis feature that we call project prioritization, which I'll go into now. So this is the main menu, the dashboard for REMI Transite. If you look here, if you are a current REMI user, if you've seen our webinars before, you're familiar probably with the forecast area. We have a number of different forecasts here. This is for the state of Georgia. We have here a central control traffic signal for the Savannah region, Atlanta arterial widening, Atlanta highway widening, suburban Atlanta arterial widening, and so on from there. What's interesting actually about these forecasts, which I'll show you in a moment, is that they were produced using a separate benefit cost analysis tool. I'll just go into the inputs list here to show what that looks like. You can see this, I'll expand everything here. All of these inputs, including construction costs, so that's conveyed as exogenous final demand, operation and maintenance costs, so we have an initial investment in the central controlled arterial traffic signals project. We have continuing costs going throughout the length of the project. We have a couple non-pecuniary amenities. Basically what that means is it's a factor that's not necessarily explicitly monetary or economic in nature, but we are through, I believe it's FHWA and US DOT, their measures of the value of the different contributing factors. They're converted into dollar values as best we can. So we have changes to safety costs. Apologies, usually there'll be something there. And then it impacts to leisure time. So this, we'll see that this project will have a benefit, net benefit to commuting time. It'll cut down on commuting time, and therefore people will enjoy. I think it's weighted about half of one's wages is that's the kind of the income or the value of leisure time. So that is how we get that value. And then we have these are benefits to vehicle operator costs. Obviously, one person's savings or benefit might be another person's lack of income or lowering in income. That's a kind of a important perspective to show, is that whereas an economic impact analysis is more, in some ways, it's more holistic and objective, like I mentioned, right? Okay, well, how are we going to express people saving money on vehicle fuel and maintenance, what have you? Well, we'll show it as a loss in spending in this sector, motor vehicle fuels, lubricants, and fluids. Whereas with a cost-benefit analysis, maybe that's not your focus. You say, okay, that is a benefit no matter what, because we're saving people money with this project. But that's just kind of a good example of how you can weigh the two different approaches. Another non-pecuniary amenity of changes in emissions. So if we see less idling and less driving overall, then we'll see improvements in emission standards. Changes in effective distance. This basically means that people traveling within Savannah, because it's specific to Savannah, People traveling within Savannah will see reductions in commuting costs, accessibility costs, and transportation costs. And I'd be happy to, if anyone's interested, to give more information on the specifics of all those. We'll just, in the interest of time, we'll just keep going. And also, we have specified how it's being funded. It's being funded via a gas tax. So I'm going to show exactly how these forecasts were generated, because these were not entered manually. Like, I didn't have to type in exogenous final demand and specify the industry, and I didn't have to do any of that. It was input using our project prioritization module. Now, this is the end result of the module. You can see here that we have the costs added up for each of these projects. The benefits are added up for each of these projects. And again, these are net present values, so they're perfectly comparable to one another. And then we end result, sort of that viability point that we're trying to determine, is a benefit cost ratio. You see, I have these, I can sort them by total benefits. So this project will have the greatest amount of benefit, not necessarily the greatest benefit cost ratio, but will have the greatest benefits. But the project with the highest benefit cost ratio is going to be the central controlled arterial traffic signals, like I mentioned, in the region of Savannah. Now I'll go into the same project to just show how it is input. And instead of being the format like the typical REMI model, where you're taking each policy variable and putting it in as you see fit, this one is more of a step-by-step process, explicit step-by-step process. So you can specify the type of project here, and then give descriptions just for your own benefit, your own reference. We're inputting different costs here, so these will be then converted into specific industry activity, like I mentioned before. If we wanted to add costs like design and planning and land acquisition, we can do that as well. We are then inputting the benefits, and this is the travel demand data that if you're a traffic planner, a regional planner at an MPO or a DOT or what have you, this is what you'll be familiar with. These are entered in, and these calculations are just entered in for reference. The calculations were done outside of the model and then entered in. So we can see, you can have different parameters for what type of inputs you have, and then all these different factors are in play here. So we see an improvement in speed, and there's no change in vehicle miles traveled. That might have been why there was no change in emissions, but yeah, everybody's getting to their destination a little bit quicker, which is great to see. And this is a breakdown of all the different costs and benefits. So obviously the end result, we want to see whether the project is viable with this benefit cost ratio, but then you can also look at all the breakdowns, right? What's the total construction, design, land acquisition costs, and what's the breakdown of the benefits? We have changes to injuries and different forms of accidents, property damage, fuel savings, different non-fuel, cost savings, travel time savings, what have you. And then we also have integrated emissions standards based on the level of driving activity. We're going to see either reductions or increases in emissions, and then like the impacts of that kind of monetization of that amenity later on. And there are other factors, like I mentioned. Discount rates can vary between projects. 7% tends to be the typical rate, but it depends on the project. It depends on the length of the project. So there's a lot of different factors there. I'm sure there are planners that have greater expertise in that than I do. For these purposes, all these projects are rated, I believe, at 7%. Here we can this is kind of what we saw before. And then I've already done this, but we have different parameters for turning this into a forecast. forecast. So we're comparing it to the standard regional control. Like I mentioned, we're comparing the experimental forecast against the baseline forecast. We're specifying the region that it's taking place in, and also what total network volume. Obviously, that calculation is being done outside of the model, but we're happy to help you figure out what that is. And then also the government funding. Now, this is a kind of a big part of the benefit cost analysis mindset, is that somebody has to spend the money for this project, whether it's a private entity on a factory, what have you, whether it's a public entity on an infrastructure project. Somebody has to pay for it through tax dollars, through revenues, what have you. So we can put this data here. And so I've already created that forecast, like I mentioned before, and I showed you that forecast. I've taken this a step further. Like I mentioned, we have the economic impact analysis, which I'll go back into the forecasts. If you're familiar with REMI, you're familiar with the economic summary table, total employment impacts, population impacts, GDP, output, labor force, value added, which if you're unfamiliar, it's a slightly different, it's a different way of measuring, but it's similar to GDP, and it can be divvied up by industry, so that's why it's useful. Actually, I think, yeah, it's very close to GDP, but it's a slightly different way of measuring it, and because it's a different way, it measuring like industry activity, it's useful for showing how much does each industry benefit or contribute to the economic activity. Personal income, disposable personal income, price index is another good example where it's not a dollar value. This doesn't really have an impact, but we oftentimes see some impact on prices. I'll just kind of integrate this a little bit. If you want any clarification on what these terms mean, you can click this information button here, and I apologize. Normally you can click that. Oh, here we go. And for example, it'll show what a price index, a personal consumption expenditure price index entails. So, but I'll get back to the analysis portion. So we have an economic impact analysis. We might compare these numbers to the numbers produced in these other numbers. And a good way of doing that is through the studies tab here. So I've actually created a study. Now, there's definitely going to be a better methodology for producing this study, which I'll go into a moment, but you can see here that I've integrated economic values directly from the model results. So we have disposable personal income, we have emissions benefits and transportation project benefits. Those, depending on your definition, those might fall outside of economic analysis, maybe more transportation project analysis or environmental analysis, what have you, but for our purposes, we'll include it under economic values. We have GDP, employment, vehicle cost savings, that's similar to transportation. And then a different score is assigned. I believe if it is the winner here, it assigns a score, or a rank of 1, a score of 7, and then it goes down from there. A rank of 7 will give a score of 1. So comparing purely economic, the Atlanta highway widening is the best option. However, I've also added some attribute values, and these were entered in manually, but weighing the benefits and the costs. We also see a benefit costs ratio that I've added. And in this way, according to these parameters, the Savannah central controlled system is a better option. And then finally, we have a final score. Now, again, this is a simple sum. Maybe very rightfully so, you'd say, well, some of these benefits aren't as important as showing a positive return on investment for whoever is doing the expenditures. We're seeing a larger impact from the Atlanta highway widening project, but it has a lower return on investment or than other projects. So in that case, you could devise your own methodology through a weighted average here. And if you'd like more information on this module, the studies module, on the the project prioritization module or just general REMI information, obviously feel free to inquire after this webinar. So that concludes the model demonstration. And this brings us to the question and answer. So thank you all for attending. I hope this was informative and useful, or at the very least thought-provoking for everybody here. I'd be happy to take some of your questions now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, David, for the great presentation, and thank you to all who attended. As earlier mentioned, in about an hour, a copy of the recording and slides from this webinar will be sent to your email. So if you have any questions about these materials, I encourage you to reach out to info@remi.com, like what's on the screen now, so we can assist you. And so, yeah, we'll get into the question portion now. If you have any questions, I encourage you to add them, because even if we don't get to them, we'll make sure to reach out to you individually. So first, CBA might have a clear line of viability, but each input has a cloud of uncertainty around its point estimate. Do you have any general advice for a looser tolerance or threshold for evaluating a CBA ratio rather than a razor-sharp line at 1.0?
Let me see if I can read the. Sorry, do you mind reading that one more time, Brian?
Yep, of course. It was cost-benefit analysis might have a clear line of viability, but each input has a cloud of uncertainty around its point estimate. Do you have any general advice for a looser tolerance or threshold for evaluating a cost-benefit analysis ratio rather than a razor-sharp line at 1.0? So I think this is what kind of you were talking about, where it's like more so than just the ratio.
Yeah. That's a great question, and I think that's partially why I say that different forms of analysis might be more nuanced. Might be the way to say it. Benefit cost analysis, you're going to want to, at the end of the day, get that ratio, or get that difference in that present value between the benefits and the costs. That's a great point, that the constituting parts might be harder to weigh one against the other. Like if we're measuring emissions against safety, oftentimes those can go hand in hand if we're improving a transportation corridor or what have you. But yeah, there's definitely a lot there to take into account. Like I mentioned, I can definitely describe the broad strokes and kind of some ideas to keep in mind when you're developing the benefit costs methodology. But there's definitely a lot that goes into figuring out how to better inform that benefit cost ratio. If you change your methodology, then a project can go from being, very viable, that we're seeing a positive or greater than 1 benefit cost ratio. But then if you change the methodology, or you take new data into account, or you limit the scope in some way, then maybe it won't be viable from that perspective. I'll definitely read that question in more detail, and I'll see if I have any better answers to it. But yeah, I think that's generally what I'd say to that.
Great, awesome, thank you. A lot of questions coming in, so we'll get back to. We'll follow up if we're not able to continue.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll keep going for now. So in EIA, are elasticities of supply considered in the REMI model? And then they gave this example. When we see a new factory, local demand come into town, prices for labor, supplies, structures will all increase, pushing other previously existing businesses to cut back. Without taking that into account, they said that could kind of be like a flawed way of analyzing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's a great point. When you have a more limited methodology, right, where you say there are simpler models out there that do this, where you say, okay, we have a new project and it's creating 500 jobs, so 500 jobs, that's what's being created. But that's not necessarily what's going to happen, right? You're going to see competitiveness, you're going to see changes in prices based on supply and demand, what have you. REMI does take into account those different elasticities of supply and demand. I think I pointed out at some point there's like a price index So it'll take into account if consumer prices are increasing or decreasing in the region. And again, it's not necessarily a good or bad thing, right? But it's something to take into account. Versus a benefit cost analysis where you're trying to get to an answer of like, should we do this or not? Yes or no. So in a way, benefit cost analysis is, it can be more practical. I think that's a good way to put it. It can be more practical. Hopefully the correct methodology is being used for the different parts of it and the calculations. But for economic impact analysis, right, you might see like an increase in employment, but then a decrease in population, let's say. That's possible, right? Where some people have to move out because it's more expensive to live there. You know, if you can have sort of a resource curse where you know, there's more competition and people are priced out of the region. You could see if there's a decrease in economic activity, oh, good, prices are decreasing, but there's, you know, not enough jobs for people to fill. So even though prices are decreased, you know, the overall quality of life, and that's something else to take into account. That essentially, I guess what we're trying to measure, hopefully, is are we doing good things or are we doing bad things? That's hopefully the goal of economic impact analysis, of benefit cost analysis. So there's definitely kind of multi-layered stuff to look at for that. But simpler answer, yeah, the REMI model does take into account those elasticities of supply and demand, takes into account kind of fluctuations in investment, in you know, capital and what have you in the region of regions. Pursuant to that, we have the economic geography angle, where if we see a boost in activity in one county, for example, then we might see increased activity in surrounding counties because, oh, look, they're demanding more goods and services and we can supply that. Or you might see a decrease because that county is then competing with surrounding counties for economic activity. And again, we draw from a large amount of and a wide range of data to make those determinations. Even something like commuter flows, where you might see a large number of jobs in one region, but all those people are commuting into the region and effectively taking the income out of the region, or not all of it. Obviously, they'll spend enough of it where they work. But those are a lot of different factors to take into consideration, and the REMI model has a lot of those factors in place. Yes.
Awesome, thank you. I think we probably have enough time for like 2 more questions, because I think the next one you'll be able to get through pretty fast. So
great.
On the cost-benefit analysis slide, if you want to just quickly run back to that, somebody asked, should that be a minus instead of a plus when talking about your equations? I think you can answer that, but I think, just me guessing, that you're assuming that the costs would be input as a negative, so adding it would just overall subtract.
Yeah. So I was you know, I was trying to think of a clear way to describe this, and yeah. So the you could view this as either so if I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but the second and the fourth equations on the bottom, assuming that the net present value of the costs is a negative value, then this would effectively be one number minus another number. You could also think of this as the net present value of benefits minus the net present value of the costs. You know, just ignoring the fact that it's a negative number. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's just the reason why we would see if the second number is greater. Essentially, if you know, if the costs are greater than the benefits, then it's going to be less than 0, or that ratio is going to be less than 1. So yeah, absolutely right though.
Awesome. All right, and we'll just get into the last one. So it is RIMS 2 and IMPLAN generally provide multipliers. So how does REMI handle indirect and induced multipliers in its framework?
How does it provide? So REMI uses essentially the same mechanism as I'm less familiar with RIMS 2 as I am with IMPLAN, but you know, IMPLAN is in large part is that input-output analysis. For the indirect impacts, yeah, REMI uses input-output to determine the indirect impacts. So that's the kind of the supply chain impacts. Induced, there's a lot more going on there that I'll be honest, I'm not as familiar with the exact mechanism or what that entails. Actually, I should walk that back a little bit. It takes into account like the personal income of the employees, right? And then their spending and creating that increased demand. So in that way, REMI is definitely more comprehensive. It's much more complex than those other models. Having said that, there are in-plan and RIMS2. These models are known for a reason because maybe they're a little bit more straightforward. There are also organizations, if it's a regional planning organization or others where these larger ripple impacts that are interesting to economists and to those that are trying to see the full impact of something happening in an economy. They're not so much interested in the ripple, they're more interested in the size of the rock that you're throwing into the pond or the more immediate indirect impacts around that. So yeah, REMI uses the same kind of mechanism of that input-output modeling, but then the added layer is the induced impact, which I wish I could have shown some numbers, but oftentimes you'll see direct is a certain number, indirect, okay, that's a certain number, and then induced can actually be quite a sizable amount of the net impacts, just because I think I mentioned like the marginal propensity to consume, where if we have $1 million of increased income, let's say it's 0.75 is the coefficient of marginal propensity to consume, then you have $150,000 more in spending. And then from that additional spending is then respent, recirculated in the economy. So that's why we see a lot of those large numbers. That's why we see, the much wider ripple impacts are important. Particularly for larger projects. If it's a smaller project, maybe it's not as useful. It's more cost efficient just to use, more just like direct and indirect impacts. I think I touched all the bases there.
Yeah, awesome. Just in respect for everybody's time, we will go ahead and wrap up now. And like we said, if you ask a question that wasn't answered, we'll make sure to reach back out to you with an explanation. So keep your eyes out for that. Thank you, David, for the great presentation. Thank you to all who attended, and thank you especially to those with the great questions. Those were all very informative and added to the discussion. And I'll just mention again that in about an hour, you'll be receiving a copy of the slides and a recording of this webinar to your email. If you have any questions from those resources, we encourage you to reach out to the email on the screen, and we'll help you in any way we can. So again, thank you so much, everybody, and we hope you have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.